we'll go ahead and get started then. Thanks for joining us, everyone, on this evening's presentation of brought to you by the Minneapolis Green Theater Alliance on Green Theater. Where do I get started? We thought that this was a really appropriate kind of first topic because I think a theme that kind of came up in some of our listening sessions this fall was that people were very interested in making green theater choices. They just kind of felt like they needed more education. And so we thought it was appropriate to kind of first start with the mindset of like, how do I start making green choices in theater before we start delving into too many specifics? Because if someone's going to watch any of our recordings in order, they can start with this one and then, go down the path of I'm a scenic designer, so I'm going to watch the scenic one, or, the various different, I say scenic designer because I'm a scenic designer, so therefore I am inherently biased, but we will have other design presentations as well. So we'll just go ahead and get started with some brief introductions. So you kind of know who's presenting here. So Lucas, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Lucas Granholm, he, him, his. I am I guess, for right now, program director of the Minneapolis Green Theater Alliance with Sadie, who's our founder and executive director. And I'm currently an assistant professor of theater arts at the University of Minnesota Morris, member at large for our regional institution of USITT, and I'm a local theatrical designer in the Midwest.
Great, thanks for that introduction.
Thank you, Sadie.
And as Luke mentioned, I'm the executive director here at the Minneapolis Green Theater Alliance. I started the Minneapolis chapter, which is, part of the Broadway Green Theater Alliance back in July. And we're just excited to be able to get some conversations started and help the theater community kind of see itself in this green light moving forward, the limelight, if you will. I'm also a local designer and artist, which is nice to be able to say after not doing a lot of theater for 2 years. I've got shows coming up in Minneapolis here, and I've got some gallery showings coming up of my own sustainable, upcycled art as well, kind of around town. So just so you kind of know who's kind of giving this presentation, you have a little context on that. So as I kind of mentioned a little bit in the first slide, we wanted to start with kind of a broad presentation to start with, because I think when you're interested in green theater, there's first a kind of a mentality shift to start with. I don't think you just kind of flip a switch and you suddenly just know how to make green theater choices, because I think a lot of people have gone to school and been trained and to do theater in a very like formal and specific kind of way. So we really wanted to make this a very broad presentation for anyone that's interested. So really anyone in theater that is interested in green theater, we're hoping that you get some takeaways on how to kind of start that green journey for yourself. Luke, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think we'll kind of circle back to a lot of these ideas too, but it's this when you start with green theater, it's not just one small area of the field. It's an all-encompassing thing. So we'll keep moving forward, but yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah. So go for it if you've got it. Want to run with it.
So one of the things that Sadie and I talked about when we were first talking about this is, where do you start? Sadie shared this really interesting saying that I'd never heard of, where you never eat an elephant in one sitting. You eat it one bite at a time, which means what, Sadie?
I think kind of what we've kind of talked about even a little bit up until this point is that changing the way that you do your art form can feel overwhelming at times. So you can't maybe some people have this ability to just sit down and be like, I'm going to just like cold turkey, do everything different. But that hasn't necessarily been my experience and my own journey of trying to make green choices, because I came from a very kind of formal college training background. So I think when you start down this path, it can feel like, oh my gosh, I have to do everything right now.
Yeah.
But I think it's much easier to focus on the incremental changes that you can be making to have a overall longer term impact. So that's been my general experience, and some of the advice that I've been giving just in general to people that are interested in green theater is that it's a process and that it's going to take time to learn how to do things differently and learn how to approach things differently, because change is hard and it won't happen overnight. But like I said, maybe some people can just like flip a switch and start doing things differently. So
yeah, and it's, you know, just for like examples, just even switching your house lights over to LED can be a daunting task, because it's not only just you know, for instance, I work at a university, and I'm trying to, where all of our stage lights are LED, but our house lights are still incandescent HPLs, and so we're working on shifting our house lights to LED, but it's trying to get everyone to realize that it's not just screwing a different light bulb in, when, especially for theater where you want precise dimming controls, things like that. And when we talk about you talked about training a little bit too, it's just, you know, we now have become kind of I always tell my students that the internet made the world a small town in certain ways. And so like you can easily find things you need on the internet, but so me trying to find the appropriate prop items, scenic elements is a lot easier. However, you also kind of lose that like students kind of lose that critical thinking aspect of how do I, if I can't Google it or search it or find it online, order it, how do I find it, how I make do? So it's kind of changing, you know, it's same with shopping small, new value system. I teach at a small rural university and we try and buy stuff in town as much as possible, right? We always, so trying to shift our kind of value system of, we could have Menards come and deliver it, or we could have it ordered in town, just slightly cheaper. But the idea of, if you ever heard the term 1,000-mile salad, have you ever heard that term, Sadie?
mm-mm.
So 1,000-mile salad is to get a salad to your plate, the total miles, all of those elements had to get to your plate. It took 1,000 miles. So this from California, this from Maine, right? This from Wisconsin. So it's this idea of kind of localizing our value system. And also, you know, it's the fear of failure, right? Designing a set with reclaimed materials or costumes or things like that can be a little daunting and scary, because the materials dictate the design more so than you dictating the materials. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, I can't buy a new bolt of muslin. What do I have, right? So utilizing the materials you have at hand. And you know, there's this idea of isolating yourself too. You know, talking about, I wouldn't say the negatives of green theater, but the challenges that it incorporates can impact your design approaches as well, which sometimes can feel isolating.
Well, and to go a little bit further off of that kind of isolating topic, one of the trends that I noticed in some of our listening conversations this fall is there was kind of this common theme of people saying, well, I didn't think anyone else cared, or I'm very passionate about sustainability, but I just didn't think that there was a way to do it in theater. So I've always just kept those things separate. And I think that that's part of what we at the Alliance want to try and do, is help the community see itself and show that there are lots of people that do care about this topic actually. And it isn't as isolating as what we might think it would be, because it's actually been very heartwarming to see how many people want to make greener choices. We just need to work through this education part of it. So I think of it as a journey altogether. And I think there's also kind of this theme of maybe I won't be hired if I'm making green theater choices, because you're restricting yourself in some ways as a designer, at least, and maybe as a director as well. So there's kind of that feel of like isolating yourself from being able to be hired and being part of the community. And I want to tie this back up to one of our bullet points. When I was an intern at Pangea World Theater, I learned a definition of art that I have found has held up over the years, that art is where discipline and philosophy intersect. And I think that green theater is a very interesting point of view on theater, because it can be both your discipline, but also your philosophy. So your discipline being the technical way that you go about making your art, whatever your art is, or your philosophy, which is, you know, kind of the values that drive your art as well. And that's what I think is kind of unique about green theater, is that it straddles both sides of that kind of discipline and philosophy approach to this definition of art. And like I said, change can be hard to change either of those as an artist over an arc of time, but I just like that definition because it just kind of helps define art a little bit. So another feeling that you may have when you're trying to start to make green theater choices is guilt. And I think this is kind of a common topic that I hear when I listen to some of my sustainability podcasts, not necessarily just theater specific, but it's this kind of idea that once you start to see how much, like really see how much waste there is in the world, you get this like overwhelming like wave of guilt. And I think that there's definitely that adage of this is the way we've always done it, that you butt up against a lot sometimes when you start to see these opportunities to making green theater. And I thought it was important to kind of talk through these kinds of feelings of being overwhelmed or being guilty, because I think that's where some people start. And I think that that can be a hard place to start when those are the feelings that you're feeling. And I think that they're valid because it's all part of change and recognizing how to change an industry as well. So I think that, Luke, do you have anything else to add to this before I keep going on this slide?
No, well, you know, once, I guess one of the things we're going to talk about positive reinforcement for this, but one of the things is once I started incorporating a lot of the practices that we kind of start talking about, you'll find that this guilt becomes pervasive in the best possible ways. You know, guilt is a good motivator sometimes to be more green. So it's like, you know, just moving the recycling bins that much closer to my shop has decreased waste so much more, just because you can't not recycle if it's right there, right? Just and keeping each other accountable too through noticing who's not recycling, I guess. the typical Midwest passive aggressive delightfulness. Yes.
And I think that there can be kind of other areas of or other feelings of guilt that can come up when you're trying to make some of these green choices. We've already kind of talked about a little bit how sometimes it can feel restricting when you maybe start making green theater choices. So sometimes your guilt can be founded in this perception of artistic inflexibility, which, you know, is a complicated kind of feeling to have as an artist, to feel restricted or having the perception of restriction as well. So I think that there can just be a lot of kind of emotional barriers to kind of work through when you start down this journey.
Mm-hmm.
So. Yeah,
and one of the things we've talked a lot of it, what we'll touch on, and I think it will be a common reoccurring process, our topic in our process through a lot of these talks is we're talking about time as a resource. And that's something the pandemic has shown a lot of light on in recent years. You know, people are kind of shifting away from 10 out of 12s, kind of thinking about our time as a little bit more of a valuable resource than, you know, instead of maybe we stagger calls, things like that. But the same with, you know, building materials and thinking about, you know, it is a lot easier to, you know, in a lot of shops to just order new sheets of Luan or Masonite instead of puzzle piecing things together, right? So it creates this vacuum of time, like, oh well, we could waste 2 hours or we could start building, right? So trying to think about time as a resource, because it's, you know, everyone hates when you have a non-productive day in the shop. It's a mood killer. So trying to think about time as a resource, even though potentially if we're taking time to alter or collect materials, what are we offsetting?
Yeah, and I think you give a really good example of like having a wasted day in the shop is a mood killer. But I think when you start to think of this in the admin side as well, You know, I think that's part of change takes time. And that's my dog Phoebe. She just likes to express her opinions sometimes. So I think that that can be part of that kind of negotiation back and forth of like, well, we could go paperless with our programs, but we're going to have to put in this upfront time to do this. So there's kind of that trade-off. So I think one thing that really, actually, Luke, you go ahead and start. I'm going to put myself on mute since my dog is barking.
Okay, sounds good. So we talk about like positive reinforcement as to kind of create this as the norm. And going back to like Say's comment of you can't eat an elephant in one bite. I'm probably paraphrasing this terribly. But doing little things can make a big impact, right? Working your way towards a main goal. So one of the things is like, say, not having paper programs. Eliminate, you know, the positive is eliminating paper, but sometimes a lot of us have patrons that want a program. They want something to twist and make a bunch of distracting sound in the audience while the show is occurring. But also even the name is escaping me, the app for stage managers where you can import your prompt book onto an iPad instead of printing a libretto and the full score and having a binder that's that thick, right? Then the downside too is, you know, having a program that, or a theater that has an iPad, things like that, softwares. So there's some equity issues as well in that. The other thing is designing with stock. My background is in lighting design, and I found myself into a scenic design kind of position. And, you know, personally, I love building. I always start with stock sizes. But, you know, sometimes it's really fun to be able to be like, you know what, I really want a custom ground row that is the London skyline with this specific, you know, but so there's this kind of restricting of your design choices for certain ways. So when thinking about, you know, designing with stock, even say, for instance, oh, hello, Phoebe, even designing around thinking several shows in mind, right? As long as we delineate our stock down through shows, thinking about that. So thinking in terms of a season as well, when you're building stuff with stock, you know, for instance, I built a, we had a 2-story Julius Caesar set a couple years ago, and we legged all the platforms and everything like stud walls. So it was a bigger investment to begin with, but because we legged everything as stud walls, we had longer lengths of 2x4s to leg everything up. So then we could keep reassociating that into our stock and reusing it. So just thinking about how you can, not only is it a positive budgetarily, but shorter strike time, less build time, which if anyone in the audience, I can't see who's all on the chat or on the video, but if anyone else is in, I think Peter was here, in higher education, right? Shorter strike time, less build time, especially right now with COVID, you know, that's a plus because we're trying to still push shows out in higher ed.
Yeah, and I think I just want to reinforce a little bit more that focusing on the positive rather than the negative will become infectious. Because I think it's always easy to think of all the things you didn't do in a production. Because I think with, you know, art and with design, if you always had more time, you could always do more things. So you can always think of the things that you didn't do in a production, whether it's green or not. So if you think of, you know, in this production, this is my green choice that I'm making, and you're being conscious of that choice, you're then going to carry that thought process to your next productions. And I think it's really about incremental change. Because even if your first step is like, I just want to work with stock scenery for this choice, that's kind of getting back to that, you know, art is, you know, philosophy and discipline intersecting. So if you're working on your discipline of like, okay, I'm going to work on using my stock sizes, you know, I'm going to lean into that, then your mentality starts to shift away from I'm being restricted by not using my stock sizes to like, I don't even have to think about that because I already know that that's the choice that's being made. So it's actually freeing up time to think about other things. And at first, because it's a change, it can feel different and feel like it's taking time to think differently. But over time, with each of those incremental changes, it'll become easier.
Absolutely.
So I think we've all heard the phrase "pick two, fast, cheap, and good." And I think that most people have heard this in whatever area of theater that we're in. But Luke and I had a conversation how this gets to be a very, it can be kind of like a capitalistic view, because it doesn't actually put the human factor into this. So we were talking about if we were going to create our own trifecta of like, how do you start thinking about green theater? Because when you start thinking fast, cheap, and good, I go back to what Luke said about you just go on the internet and you find the quickest, fastest thing that you can get to and you get it on stage. But if you start thinking about things in terms of space, people, and budget, it starts to humanize the choice, and it starts to make it less about the thing that you're getting and more about the impact that your choice has, because sustainability is beyond just material choices. It's also about making sustainable choices for yourself and also the people around you. So we're gonna see if we can start a thing by saying space, people, and budget. So that's gonna be our trifecta.
Well, and and we'll kind of go into detail about this too. You know, they intersect in a lot of different ways too down the road. The more you unpack space, people, budget, the more, because we kept thinking of we kept unpacking and going further and further and further. And I think it's a big conversation that we can have. And, you know, good, cheap, and fast is something that, you know, I've been teaching this ride or die for years. And now I'm like, you know, I'm on my 6th year of teaching at a small liberal arts theater program. And I was like, I'm getting pretty tired of good, cheap, and fast, because I am tired, hungry, and want to go home. All right. Pick three.
That's a different pick. So space. So I've worked in a lot of different theaters of a lot of different sizes. I've worked in big theaters where it feels like there's huge amounts of space. And I've also worked in smaller nomadic companies where there literally is no space. And regardless of the size of the actual theater, everyone always needs more space. And particularly when you start thinking of green theater, space becomes even more valuable. So I think that this is a common thing that has come up in some of our listening conversations of if only there was more space to store things. If only there was more space to build things. So I think that this does, it does kind of put a light on what is already a difficult situation for most theaters, is that space is a valuable thing for theaters. And when it comes to green theater, there's a couple different ways that space is maybe used a little bit differently when you're starting to think about your materials in a different way.
Yeah, you know, it's one of those things. I worked for Prairie Repertory Theater, and they had a few years ago, and they had a brand new space at South Dakota State University. And I've always worked in theaters that have back rooms packed, or like someone's garage or storage units and things like that. And it's just so funny how, like, I walked into this theater and they had all these storage rooms that had so much space, and I was like, oh my God. My first thought was, you get to fill this with stuff. And then zoom back to a different theater, I'm like, why do they have so much stuff? There's this kind of mentality of like, we need more things. I need my prop room to look like Pee-wee's Playhouse all the time, and I need to move my workspace like that. But you know, thinking about, and there are programs, for instance, I'm going to do a quick plug for Sadie. For instance, Next Stage, which is a new and up and coming organization in Minneapolis, where they're as a rental unit. I'm butchering what this is, as a restorative, rentable, scenic company. And not only that, I'm speaking for your company now, I'm sorry. And not only that, picking up stuff instead of, you know, throwing stuff in the dumpster at strike, like having people sort through the wreckage of your set. If you want to be a little more eloquent with that too, you definitely can.
Yeah, so the mission of Next Stage is to basically divert as much waste from the landfill as possible. And we're doing that through a couple of different branches of the organization. One is creating a rental stock that is accessible so that people can review our catalog online, because that is a huge, back to the people aspect of it, making sure that people can plan, and as a production, props and scenic can go to the same website and find things. So there's rental, there's Strikeforce, which Trevor's on this call and I know how much he loves Strikeforce, where instead of using a dumpster, you could hire Strikeforce to come take your set away, and we will break it down and we will put the materials into our reclaimed store. So instead of purchasing new, you can purchase reclaimed materials. And then we're also creating sustainable art panels from offcuts of scenery. So we're gathering scraps from shops that are too small to be scenic pieces, and we're turning that into art panels, which is a different aspect of the industry, that we are the first company to offer zero waste art panels in the country, actually.
And I do the same. I do not as eloquent as Sadie does, but for instance, offcuts, things like that. We throw everything off that's shorter than our elbow to our fingers, right? But instead of throwing it out, since I live in at the University of Minnesota Morris is a rural farming community, we have a lot of people that use wood burning stoves in their shops, things like that. So we have an open call. We don't throw our lumber in the dumpster. We have wood only bins behind our shop. And so local farmers, artisans, craftsmen will come by, check our bins almost every day, and I don't have to fill a dumpster ever either they're burning it or they're repurposing it for farm hacks or whatever it be. So that's been a tremendous boost for our storage as well, because it's like, believe me, I'm the last person to want to throw away a 2x4, especially now. Have you seen the prices? But trying to keep space to a minimum. A lumber rack can only hold so much.
Right, and you can see how space has created this culture of throwing things away because space is so valuable. So when you're talking about green theater too, you also need space to gather things, because usually with green theater, you aren't necessarily just going right to the store and just purchasing a thing exactly on the day that you need it, but you're usually gathering things over time. Mm-hmm. And then also space to store items for reuse, which we've touched on a little bit already. Most theaters have a stock of some kind, but when you really start thinking really intently about green theater, you start thinking beyond just like, what is the furniture that I'm saving? But you get into the 2x4s and the things like that. Mm-hmm. And then also space to build and adapt things, because most folks are used to having some kind of space for their scene shop. But if you're starting to work with materials in a different way, you might need to use space in a different way. And the example that I like to talk about is this plastic bottle drop that I have been working into 2 different productions. I did it's a hanging drop of bottles tied together with fish line, which is as tedious as it sounds, but it's really cool with lights. But it also tangles really easily. So the way that you construct this, like in a very traditional theater approach, you would like never do it because it just takes so much to just keep it straight. And so I did it first with Eastridge High School for a production of SpongeBob, and now I'm doing this bottle drop for my production of Little Mermaid at Lakeshore Players. And it's very space consuming. And I think that is just a reality that we all face, that when we're trying to make these green theater choices, that if you don't have the space, it will be hard. Because if, for example, if Lakeshore had programming in their black box this year, I probably wouldn't have been able to accomplish this bottle drop, because I was tying each of these strands of bottles together with fish line and then hanging it in their black box, which was fine because there was no rehearsal and no production. But in more of a traditional cycle, it would have been really hard to try and figure out, the space gives me a longer sense of time to be able to do this. So, that space becomes a really important factor in some of these green theater choices as well. And then people/time, because I think, as we mentioned a little bit already, that sustainability isn't just about materials. it's also about the people involved, because I think we've probably all experienced on some level some burnout in theater, which is usually a key indicator that what you're doing isn't sustainable. And I think that there's a couple different reasons for that. But I think a big part of it is that green theater can really just take more time. Because I think, Luke, one thing that you talk about when you're talking about a green production is how much further in advance you have to start a green production than, say, a traditional theater production.
Yeah, one of the things, and possibly down the road, we'll do some case that we'll follow our socials. There'll be case studies, but we'll just circle back. Circle back. My elbow leaned on my keyboard. So what was the question again? I got flustered.
How you have to start earlier with a green production.
Excuse me, I have the zoomies. One of the things with green theater is I've done a few fully reclaimed shows in terms of designs, and there's this idea of collecting materials and altering materials. Like you can't. So trying to pick a design or trying to pick materials to use that you have a lot of, or you need to collect them. But also thinking about in terms of time, we also mean season. It is a lot harder to do green theater in the winter in Minnesota because things get snowed on, right? We as theater designers, we love curbside stuff. I'm the biggest fan of curbside pickup in terms of like any free stuff. But the moment that couch gets snowed or rained on, I'm not taking it. So trying to think of, to having these conversations really early in advance. If you're doing a 6 to 8 week out build, design, rehearsal process, that's not necessarily going to be enough time for you unless there's a lot of stock already for you. And this kind of depends on how far out you go. Or how extreme you want to go. If you're doing a fully sustainable production, say with all reclaimed materials found and scavenged, it's going to take a lot more time. Altering materials and gathering materials takes a lot of time. And then circling back to space, while you're gathering materials, you need the space to hold all of them. So whenever we've done kind of sustainable style productions at Morris, I make a lot of piles in my shop. And it's fun, but also it can get smelly, or it can get sticky, or it can just get kind of like, why is there a fridge door just sitting in the middle of our shop? And I'm like, oh, I might need it. I don't know. So trying to alter and build materials, but then scavenging and finding materials you might need. You don't know. It's a little bit more of a devised process because you're not going to get exactly what you want. Very rarely you're going to get what you can make do with. Not to say that that's bad. It's just a different way of approaching design and thinking about design. Going back to, just like, it's just so easy to get anything you need on Amazon. And it's like, oh, I'm doing arsenic and old lace and I need a trumpet. Oh, there's a really cheap, really kind of crappy trumpet on Amazon right now I could buy for $50 instead of trying to scavenge, right? Then we have one, right? But it's just kind of going back and forth on those kind of ideas of, but then it doesn't create, it takes people out of the equation as well. Mm-hmm. Which is, then go watch a movie at that point. Don't do theater.
I think another part of that we've discussed when we were prepping this presentation is when we're talking about starting a green production early, it's about having a conversation early too with the people involved in a production, because it's kind of difficult to feel like you're making green choices and not tell anyone about them because you have all of these other factors going on.
It's like, why is Sadie always in the dumpster?
Why?
Like,
Yeah, I have Sadie always got bags of stuff in her car. So I've now made it a point at production meetings to say, I'm trying to make green choices. And because of these green choices, these are some of the ripple effects that we're going to have, in terms of.
It'll be like in Shakespeare's time, there's only one script everyone has to share the ones. I'm kidding.
But I think that that's also an important part of the people factor of green theater is that conversation piece of it. And conversation does take more time, but that's also how you get people on board with these choices too, instead of, again, isolating yourself and making these green choices without other people knowing about it.
Ooh, our favorite.
Money, money, money.
Money, 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 money. Do you want to start budget, Sadie?
Yeah, so I think the thing with budget, when it comes to green theater is Trevor likes money. He is our accountant on the call that's for sure. You generally save money. That's a generally true statement with green theater, but you're also going to spend money differently. It's not like your budget is just going to immediately like, oh, we have all this money now because we're scavenging for all these materials. Because part of the reclaimed materials process is altering them a little bit too. And you want to make sure you're doing that safely, which will be another slide in a little bit, safely doing these things. But what you may save in materials, you might end up spending in labor, depending on what your situation is. Because what we've kind of described is, some of these things are more time intensive. So that's kind of that balance that you start to find, and kind of getting back to like focus on your incremental changes, right? Like you're not going to just like suddenly like overnight see a huge shift in your budget because you did this green theater choice. But as you start to turn the dial a little bit more with every production, you'll eventually see those budgetary shifts in the way that, hey, because we started reclaiming a little bit more of our scenery instead of just throwing it away, we've actually made a 10% budget savings. You might not see that immediately, but you might see it over time. And when we're also talking about spending differently, you might be spending more money on transportation than on physical materials. So then that also gets to be this trade-off a little bit of, am I driving so far that I'm creating a carbon footprint that doesn't make it worth it to get this one little thing?
The 1,000-mile set.
The 1,000-mile salad. But if it's something that is big enough that the transportation offsets it, that's what you kind of have to start to think of those trade-offs a little bit more. Luke, do you have anything to add to this budget?
Yeah, it's one of the things too, and we'll talk about this, I guess we'll talk about, in terms of spending less, it also brings in more in different ways, because it's something that people are generally interested in. By and large, people want to recycle. People want to lessen their footprint. So, if a theater company is saying we're making an effort, to lessen our footprint on the environment around us, that's something that people are going to notice and want to participate with, see, buy a ticket, donate. And the whole idea too is we talk about time as a budget, budgeting time, altering materials takes time, and that's different for every case. And collecting materials takes time, having volunteers moving things for you. Traveling, right? It's a different mindset. Going right back again to like us talking about how time, the pandemic has kind of forced us to think about time a little differently in terms of theater practices. Maybe an all-nighter redoing this whole lighting plot isn't the best use of my time. How can I alter things? Right now, a lot of stuff is, I saw in the chat, I think Trevor had said it's an investment, and which I 100% agree with, right? When you're building a set, thinking about, say for instance, I'm gonna go back to this large Julius Caesar set I built. We invested more in lumber, to leg the we had 2-story platforms, all sorts of stuff, investing more in the lumber, and to build it in a certain way that gives us less offcuts, so we can have whole standard length lumber again to go back into our stockpile, right? It was probably maybe about $400 more, to build our set that way, but then we got that back, right? This is a long game. This is not a short game.
And I think other industries have also kind of figured this out a little bit already.
Mhm.
I sometimes look to architecture as a field that's kind of figuring it out a little bit already, because it's kind of a clear trend in architecture that with a green building, you're going to spend more upfront to make those green choices, but over time, the return on investment is proven to come back to you. And so that's where it's kind of like you have to trust the process a little bit and trust your values, that if you're doing the right thing, it's going to pay off over time.
Safety.
Safety dance.
Safety
Dance.
I'll start a little bit. Repurposing materials can be messy, right? And it actually, I approach it from an educational standpoint, which I think actually really helps. One of the things that we talk about is like off gassing. We've now learned carving foam is not good for you. A hot knife on foam is not good for you. Blend, melt. If I'm bending this material or heating it up or altering it in certain ways, am I making it more dangerous? Am I putting myself at risk? We've all have horror stories of things that we did when we were starting out of like, I'll alter this. I know what I'm doing. And that's how a dust fire started in my shop. But it didn't, it ended, it's fine. But I was altering materials in a way that I shouldn't have done it. So, educating yourself in what you should do, and more importantly, what you shouldn't do. And from an educational standpoint, it's also benefits the students more too. It's like, maybe we shouldn't melt plastic, right? In a non-vented shop, right? Or maybe we should wear masks. One of the things that I've noticed very much so now with the pandemic, University of Minnesota, where I teach, has a mask mandate. And so I'm wearing a mask every day for the past 2 years in a shop. And you know what? I'm breathing a little better because I'm wearing a mask, and, because I'm filtering out a lot of particulates that I normally breathe in. And one of the things too is we always talk about, I'm guilty of this. I've made pallet furniture. I fell into the Pinterest trap of pallet furniture. And one of the things is probably shouldn't have made that coffee table out of a pallet that I found at a speedboat factory. It probably had chemicals on it. It probably had gasoline on it. Knowing a little bit about the history of the materials you're getting is always a plus as well. Because certain things such as gasoline on wood can really impact some things. Even like, for instance, trying to think, thinking about just like if we're using natural materials, like if I buy hay bales, if I'm doing of mice and men or something like that, I should probably double check to make sure there's not pesticides on it, right? Because an actor is going to put one in their mouth and start chewing on it. It's going to happen. It happened, right? So thinking about that kind of stuff, thinking about safety in ways of, am I altering this material in the right way? It creates teaching moments. Am I using this tool the right way to alter this material, right? Probably shouldn't try and cut a bowling pin in half on a bandsaw. That's how the fire started. So, those are things that you have to do. But I gotta say, those bowling pin footlights looked great. I just should have altered it a different way. Sadie, do you have anything to add before I start the fire?
I think everything that you've described up until this point, because I think theater is kind of notorious for not always putting safety first. So I think when you start I've always kind of had this analogy of like, you can have a to-do list of 10 things and make green theater your 11th choice, or you can look at your to-do list with your green theater lens and do all 10 things while thinking of green things. So instead of making it the 11th thing on your 10 item to-do list, do each item with that green lens. And so when you start to think about safety through that green lens, you're going to start thinking about yourself in a different way and the environment, maybe in a different way than what has been traditionally taught or what has been traditionally experienced in theaters. And I think that this ties back a bit to what we were talking about time too, right? Kind of what you're talking about, starting a fire because you cut the bowling pin, just going for it. It's probably because like you maybe felt like you didn't have time to do it. And it's a very common thing that accidents happen when people feel rushed and people feel like there isn't time for things. And so that's getting to that. I'm going to keep saying it again. It's about the incremental choices. Because if you feel like I'm going to make this green choice, but I don't know if it's safe, maybe don't do it, right? If you don't feel like you have the time to do that research, maybe this isn't the production to make that incremental change. So focus on your other incremental changes in the production. And that's a good thing, to focus on the good, safe, green choices that you can be making and not worrying about some of the green choices that you didn't make because you didn't have time. Focus on that positive aspect and keep feeding into that, because the reason we're all doing this is so we can be safe and make sure the environment is safe at the same time too. You know, that is ultimately why we're all doing this. So
Absolutely.
advocates. So as Sondheim says, and I think I've mentioned this a little bit.
Sorry. I double jumped, so I'll go back to sphere of influence. We'll do advocates first.
Yep. But you can be an advocate, and that can be part of how you can help make green choices happen. You know, by raising these things early in a production meeting, by raising safety concerns, you know, you're helping promote green theater in that way, and you're not alone in this. And I think the thing to keep in mind when you're maybe thinking that you're a voice in a crowd that doesn't want to hear you is that you're actually part of a national movement, because this is what the Broadway Green Alliance is trying to do. And this is a conversation that's happening across the country. It's not just Minneapolis. So by raising this and bringing it to people's attention, you know, you're helping a national movement.
I double clicked. I apologize. We thought carefully about the order of this. It's my first day. So we talk about sphere of influence. A lot of this we've already said, right? You know, it isn't just about your choices. It's a group, right? Theater's a team sport. I wasn't good at team sports, but I was good at theater as a team sport. So talking about, you know, everyone has to agree, you know, and the ripple effects of that, individual, interpersonal, social institutions, and community. Community is a big part of it, and we're going to circle back to that as well. A lot of circling back in this, a lot of spheres of circling back in terms of influence. But you know, it's instilling these principles. University of Minnesota Morris is a very, we are carbon neutral in electricity on our campus. We have, you know, on campus composting. Every single use piece of plastic in our dining hall and everything is compostable. So it's a big part of our culture. And being, I'm now a professor there, but also being an alum of the institution after leaving the institution, right? That had a big effect on me. When you are in an environment, in a community that values recycling and composting and all this stuff, it's really hard to shift back, right? It's really, you know, we're talking about that sphere of guilt, right? It's jarring to move to go to a community that might not recycle, right? The guilt of just a plastic bottle going into the waste bin, right? So thinking about how, you know, the ripple effects of this, just one choice can really domino into different things.
Yeah, and I think that in the way that we all wear different hats in different environments that we're in, the way that we have a sphere of influence in different environments is similar, because you might be a manager at your job. So you might think, oh my gosh, I'm managing. It's so hard to integrate green choices into this. But like if you are a manager of people and you say, you know what, recycling and the environment's important, so we're going to have compost and recycling in our place of business. That small choice then helps message out to staff that this is a value. So even though it feels like a small choice, it's impacting lots of people around you. And I think that that's true in the couple of different settings that, you know, theater kind of traditionally hangs out in. So I'm thinking of professional theaters, community theaters, academic theaters. There's lots of ripple effects that can happen when you start making these green choices that you might not see sometimes. Because I think of with Next Stage particularly, we have our material donation bins that we have dropped in shops to help capture these offcuts. And we notice that there is inherently less stuff going in the trash because people are putting stuff in those material saving bins instead of going right to the trash. And then people are actually going back to the bin and pulling it out because it sat there for a little bit longer than if it had just gone in the trash. And I think of the ripple effect that that has on a shop that functions in that way, to say this is a value and we're really standing by it, of how that then manifests in people's lives outside of work as well. And I think of also in all of this, we're talking about theater and we actually haven't talked about the audience too extensively yet, which is like a sign that the tech production people are maybe talking about this. But I think that there is a really great community engagement aspect to a theater production when you can start to share the story of how your production is green, because it's kind of this like elephant in the industry that we don't like to talk about, right? Because audience members that don't make theater, it's just like, it's theater magic, right? The lights come up, the thing is there, the lights go down, and like part of the magic is that you don't know where that stuff comes from. But it's kind of like when you start to see like fair trade labels on things. It's like, oh my gosh, I never thought about where my coffee comes from, or my chocolate or my bananas. But because you have that indicator that makes you start thinking about it, that's what starts to get those incremental shifts. So by messaging your green theater choices, you start to get a different kind of community engagement. And one thing that Luke and I have both talked about is the kind of community engagement that specifically comes from materials donations or collection drops, because it also helps the community create a sense of ownership over the show. And the one example that I really like to talk about, of course, is my bottle drop, because I had Eastridge High School, these families gathering these bottles for their own production. And then when I was able to say, hey, I'm actually using all of these bottles in this production a few months later in Little Mermaid over here, all of them said, I want to see that production. Because they then felt a sense of ownership because they know what it takes to put it on. They have that piece, that contribution to the show. So I think it puts a little bit of community back into the theater experience. Luke, do you have more to add to that?
No, I the photo here is from one of our community drop-offs that we did, a green theater of Midsummer Night's Dream. And we would just kind of update stuff daily through social media and on this whiteboard, like what we're looking for. We even just put out a call for weird collections. If any, so that's circling back to the bowling pin. Someone bought a house in town that had a bowling alley in the basement, and they didn't want, they didn't want the bowling. So it's like, I got a full set of like multiple sets of bowling pins that are just, that were, a hard to find item actually. And if you want to buy one new, they're annoyingly expensive, right? But finding these eventually then we turned that, because we got so many bowling pins, we turned the mechanicals in our production into a bowling team, right? So that worked its way into the concept of the show, as opposed to just like a small little element. So just that kind of quick tidbit makes people a lot more interested in the show. And also, in smaller rural communities where theater might not be as big a pull, i.e. us, we pull big audiences with green theater productions, because not only is it enjoyable to watch because it's inventive and something different, but like Sadie said, people, even they donated one bottle, they're a lot more interested in it because they at least put their fingerprints are on it in some way.
Yeah, and I think that community engagement, another way that you can define it with green theater, is the partnerships that you can develop with other like or similar organizations. This is a conversation that comes up a little bit with Next Stage as well, is kind of thinking about this life cycle analysis of a scenic piece, because one of the first easy things that we recommend to like making something green is like, just find someone else that will take it, rather than put it in the trash. Like that's the first like easiest thing that you can do to keep something out of the trash, is give it to someone that's doing a like production with you. And I think that there is a kind of community that you can find when you find like-minded people that value that, and it helps break down that kind of silo effect of, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this item now? So there's lots of different ways that you can create community, whether it's gathering things or whether it's getting rid of things as well.
Sorry, I have a little bit of lag, and so I accidentally double click when things don't work. And
so we've been talking for a while about a couple different topics. So I think the biggest takeaway we want to have people take from this presentation is just think about what is your next choice. I know Luke isn't a Frozen fan, but I think of Anna and Frozen 2 of do the next right thing. So the other nice thing with Green Theater is it helps you actually feel in control of your choices, because instead of thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a victim to the schedule, you can say, no, I want to make this choice. I'm going to make one green choice, and that is going to be my commitment in this production. Because if you make one choice with every production, you're going to make a lot of choices over time. So that is kind of maybe our call to action out of this presentation is like, what is your one green choice you're going to make in your next production? And it can be small. The example that I like to give of like small choices. I did a show down in Florida this January, and it was a very traditional set. You know, it's really hard to make green choices when you're trying to do a veranda porch, kind of style show. It's just hard to do green choices when you're doing very naturalistic kind of theater. And I remember the props person, there's a bit where the actress is supposed to spray herself in Static Guard. And the props person checked in with me to said, do you like this label of this Static Guard? And I thought, we don't have to spray chemicals in this situation. We can find a chemical-free spray in this situation. And that is the one choice that I held on to in that production of like, we made a greener choice by not adding any extra chemicals to the air every single night for 4 weeks. So those are the kinds of positive small choices you can start to focus on while you're starting to make these changes.
Yeah. I'm gonna click. I'm gonna click. I'm gonna click forward because we're running kind of long, I think. So, but I would totally agree. You know, one of the things too is like reworking work light circuits. Do I need all of my house lights on while I'm loading in my set? No, I'm not going into the house. Just leave the lights on above the stage deck. That's all you need, right? That's my little win for the day, right? My green win. Hashtag green win.
And there is actually one thing on that slide I want to talk about.
Oh, sorry.
But sometimes your green choice can be call a friend and talk through your idea, because I think it can be really hard if you get in your own head and think too much about something. You can just kind of like go in circles of like trying to figure out a solution, and you're more likely to commit to something if you talk to someone about it. So if you are trying to make a choice and you're like, I think this idea could work, but I'm not sure, call someone and ask, because that is going to increase your chances of making a green choice if you talk to someone about it, because you're going to feel accountability, and that person that you talk to is going to help you feel accountable as well. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So that is our presentation in about an hour. We've got some other presentations coming up that are going to be materials specific. So we have brush up on paint maintenance and recycling March 16th, which is a month from today. And then we also have creativity in cardboard, which is a presentation on how can we use cardboard more in theater, because it's a very readily available and highly recyclable material that maybe we don't always think of in some of the traditional ways that we have been taught theater. Those are what we currently have on the schedule. We're working on other presentations. We just don't have dates on them yet for scenic design, props, costumes, the intersectionality of sustainability and equity, diversity, inclusion. That intersectionality is really important to environmental social justice overall. So that will also be, I'm really looking forward to that presentation. But those are some upcoming workshops. If anyone has a workshop that they're really interested in, please feel free to reach out to us and we can see what we can develop over time. We really love feedback, because that is going to be what informs what programming and initiatives we offer moving forward. You can connect with us on Instagram and Facebook, and you can visit our website at minneapolisgreentheateralliance.com. So,
And one of the things too, one of the things that Sadie and I have always talked about too, if you have a green project or something that you're doing, we want to, we don't want to just hear our voices. We want to amplify yours.
mhm.
So if you have something that you want to showcase or something you've done, send it to us. We'd love to share it. We want to share green success stories with all of you.
Yeah, that's, I'm glad you remembered that. So well, that is the formal part of our presentation. So if anyone has any questions, we'll open it up to questions at this point. If there's anything that people thought we didn't cover, or maybe want to speak in more depth on, or you have your own experiences you'd like to share.
Yes. Peter.
I feel like I've been hiding over here for an hour. This is great. This is really great. I just really need to hear what you're saying. I agree fully. But, you know, it's been easy to get into, you know, the way I was trained when I went through grad school and stuff. And this just really resonates though. And I appreciate it. And all good stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you said you were including the equity, diversity, inclusion, because you did touch on the ideas about sustainability and equity and how that works. And it's like the co-op, you know, you really love to shop that way, but it's crazy expensive. And then it's all about the labor, and then we also have to pay labor. So it's not necessarily a more economic way to work on the particular show, but in the bigger picture that the value is in something different. I'm coming from a theater that has gone from having a full costume shop, a full costume stock, a full prop stock, to suddenly having none of that. So I'm kind of also looking and really interested in the resources that we have for sourcing things that already exist. And I know, Sadie, yes, you'll be hearing from me.
Well, and you know, that's interesting too, is like, you know, we talk about theater is basically just a small town, right?
Exactly.
You know, somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody. And so like, why aren't we using that network that we have to source out materials more?
I think, you know, any of the small theaters especially in the Twin Cities, that's what we're constantly using, borrowing, etc. Hey, off the bed. You know, from each other. I'm also now heavily into the Buy Nothing, Facebook, Kingfield and Tangle, Buy Nothing groups on Facebook. You know what these are? Yeah, so
like the free community marketplace kind of stuff.
Exactly right. So I'm actually really using that as a resource as well for us, both as we have moved from a space and have been trying to get rid of things but the time, I mean, it's also like the luck of finding the person who has the thing at that moment, or finding that, or giving away something that at that moment, you know, people have been looking before and they don't need it now. So it's always that that kind of dilemma, and that's the work.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned, Tree, that I think is a really important topic, that once Trevor gets past tax season, I'm going to hold him to a financial presentation.
Yes.
But when you say it may not be the most economical choice, that's part of the culture shift, but also how can we build a structure that captures that value add that we have? And I always look to the triple bottom line. There's the financial impact, which most of us have a pretty good understanding of a financial bottom line, but then there's also social and environmental.
Absolutely.
So instead of having an annual statement that just has that financial bottom line, how can we get organizations to start developing the triple bottom line? So we're not just thinking of the financial aspect of things, but how are we quantifying our social and our environmental impact along the same, you know, at the same level of importance that we have always in our capitalistic society put financial success as well. So that will probably be a topic that will take a little bit more time to develop over time, but
the next step of that for me is, as the small nonprofit, what kind of grant money do we find out there in this community for this is exactly the kind of, where are those grants going right now for, sustainability in the arts, and where can we find that money to help us move these things forward in our small nonprofits
Mhm.
as well.
Definitely. And I
Yeah.
think there's also one area of grants as well, kind of going a little bit back to the architecture side of things, but
Mhm.
like, what are the grants that are available that we can greenify our buildings too? Because it's not
Exactly.
it's not just doing productions, but it is like, how can we get more efficient heating systems? How can we get more efficient lighting systems, HVAC systems? That takes money too, but that also has a great impact as
Right.
an organization is not just focusing on a production by production choice, but also an overall environmental impact as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm following my dog downstairs to me so he can eat something.
And when you're doing that in a theater, it's exponentially more expensive than some other structures. I mean, with the systems that we have, I mean, just a dumb example. I've had 2 lighting companies come in and put in a bid for replacing our house lights with dimmable LEDs. And we talked about color, temperature, and the dimming curve, and all. I've spent 2 days with 2 different companies, and that was years ago, and nothing happens.
Yeah, I'm on year 4 of my house light LED overhaul. We haven't started yet. It's been a lot of talk because, especially with the infrastructure for theaters, it's especially with LED dimming curves and things like that, you have to swap out your patch bays too, right? I had to swap out my CMED or my dimmer brain and upgrade that in my space. So we're talking about e-waste too. I still have like the old dimmer brain or the dimmer rack brain sitting in my booth because it's like, I don't want to throw it away, but I also don't, like no one's going to use it, right? Copper is what, $6 a pound now, so maybe I can think of some of that. But thinking about, when we'd make these changes too, like there's a lot of talking. Peter, you and I are both coming from a university perspective too, and sometimes university wheels move slow as well. So it's like trying to get things moving and turning the ship takes time.
Yeah, but the campus always talks the talk. We got this company coming in. We're gonna do it on.
Yeah.
But
Yep, and I think a big part of it is just perception shift, right? It's a green house light system is like, for us, it's going to be like, oh, like an LED house light. Oh, sweet, you got LED house light. But Joe patron coming off the streets and be like, oh, it's really bright in here. How nice. Like they're not going to realize how much work went into that, until we kind of make this a bigger sphere of influence. Circling back again, Sadie.
All about circles.
As simple as that example is, it's a great place to start because those things are on all day, and it just like every time you turn around, so it's just
and I don't know what it is about theater spaces, but that is the one room people forget to turn the light off in.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't tell you how many times I've come into my theater and all the lights are on because there was a tour and they got distracted. They were talking. And so I was like, oh, great. I've been pulling a couple thousand watts all weekend. Right. It's one of those things where you have to really dig into the community and tell them, you can't do this.
Well, I'm going to give a big shout out to the new 2 spaces at Center for Performing Arts in South Minneapolis that are fully LED spaces. And they did go ahead and purchase some old halogen instruments from like the Illusions, reusing those and just having mini dimmers, at each instrument. And it's been a really great example of reuse and reducing their footprint. Big shout out to Jackie Hayes over there.
Well, and picking it from that too as well, incandescent fixtures aren't going away for a while still. They're still making source 4 incandescents. And so this idea of like, we still, Peter, you were at South Dakota State. You saw Corey's new space at South Dakota State, right?
What, say that
You
again?
saw Corey Shelsta's space at South Dakota State, right?
You know what? I haven't
Oh,
been
so-
out since it was completed.
So it's a
Oh,
South Dakota State.
I did a walkthrough.
Yeah.
And there was a lot in place. It wasn't that
Yeah,
far
South
out.
Dakota State, they made a point to still keep dimmers in the space instead of going fully LED
Mhm.
because from an educational standpoint, you know, we don't want to just huck all of these lighting fixtures in a dump either, right? So
Because
at least get a few more miles out of them.
for years. Yeah.
But I know, like talking with Corey Shelsta, he was like, it's just so weird to see only like 20 dimmers in that space when it's an 800 seat theater, right?
There should be hundreds.
So it's just this perception change too, you know, like I used to like be like, "God, I don't have enough dimmers in my front of house. And now I'm like, oh, I've got tons because I don't have anything hooked up to them.
So. Exactly.
Thank you so much. I have to run. I look forward to more. Sadie, I'll be in touch. Thank
Great,
you.
great, sounds
Thank
good.
you. Well,
I think I'll go ahead and I'll